welcome to the deep dive. You've shared your sources, and we're here ready to pull out the key insights, getting you up to speed quickly.
Yeah, and today we're looking at something pretty significant, this idea of the commodification of science. How commercial pressures are, well, maybe affecting how trustworthy research is.
Right. And we're focusing specifically on a paper you sent over called The Commodification of Science, a crisis of credibility and the need for a Symphonics Paradigm.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to understand the argument this paper makes about, a crisis in scientific credibility, and then dig into the solution it puts forward.
Okay, let's get right to it then. This term, commodification of science, what does it actually mean in, everyday terms? Sounds a bit academic.
It does, yeah. But essentially it boils down to a shift where economic goals, market thinking start to take precedence over the traditional aims of science, seeking truth, expanding knowledge. The paper actually mentions Hans Ratter's definition from 2010. He called it the economic instrumentalization of science. Basically, using science as a tool for economic ends.
So it's kind of like science being treated more like a product or a business venture, less like a pure quest for understanding.
That's a good way to put it. And that shift, it really impacts how things work day to day.
How so?
Well, it affects what kind of research gets funded, what's seen as important. It influences how research is done, the methods, and even the motivations behind it all.
Right. Because if money or marketability becomes the main goal.
Exactly. Then the paper argues, there's a risk of compromising on things like careful methods, objectivity, the real bedrock of good science.
And the paper brings up another source, Lee Harvey's 2020 paper on research fraud. It suggests this pressure, this commodification, can lead to some pretty worrying behavior.
Absolutely. Harvey's work points out that this intense competition for grants, the money and the constant push to publish in those big-name journals, it creates an environment.
An environment
where, frankly, the temptation to cut corners, maybe fudge the data a bit, or even commit outright fraud becomes much stronger. It's logical, in a way, if your whole career, your funding, depends on splashy results.
That's a really uncomfortable thought.
Yeah.
So this pressure for the top journals, the high impact factors, is it becoming less about the actual quality of the science?
The paper argues that the intense focus on these metrics, like impact factors, can sort of unintentionally push researchers towards flashy topics, things that grab attention, get citations.
Even if the research isn't as solid?
Potentially, yes. The focus shifts from, is this reliable, rigorous work, to where did it get published and how many people are citing it? It's not that wanting impactful research is bad, of course not.
Oh, yeah, obviously.
But it's how that metric itself can be gamed. Journals might favor certain types of studies, or there have even been suggestions of journals pushing authors to cite their own papers more.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just to boost their numbers. It kind of distorts the picture of what's truly valuable or crucially reproducible.
Which brings us neatly to this replication crisis we hear so much about. Can you unpack that a bit? Why is it such a big deal?
Okay, so the replication crisis is basically this: a worryingly high number of published scientific findings. Well, they can't be reproduced.
Meaning other scientists try to do the same experiment and don't get the same results?
Exactly. Independent teams try to follow the original recipe, so to speak, and they just don't get the same outcome. The paper cites some, frankly, alarming figures from Harvey's research again.
Like what?
Like replication rates potentially as low as 40% in psychology, and maybe only 10% in some areas of medicine.
10%? Wow. That's a real wake-up call. Especially in medicine, it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It really does. The implications are huge.
And the paper mentions a cost too, right? A financial cost to all this irreproducible research.
Yeah, a big one. A PLOS survey back in 2015 estimated something like $28 billion wasted annually just on research that ultimately couldn't be verified.
$28 billion. That's staggering. Money that could be going into, well, research that actually works.
Precisely. More reliable, impactful science.
But why is it so hard to replicate studies? Is it just, sloppy work sometimes?
That can happen, sure. But the paper argues it's more systemic than that. It points to the incentives within science.
The incentives? Like the funding and publication pressure we just talked about.
Exactly. There's so much emphasis on novelty, on being the first to discover something, that there's very little reward or even recognition for doing the careful, sometimes tedious work of just replicating someone else's study.
I see. It's not seen as glamorous.
Not really. Sometimes it's even seen as less important than pushing out something new, even though replication is absolutely fundamental to how science is supposed to work, how it checks itself.
So it's not just random mistakes. It sounds like the system itself, the pressure for grants and publications, might be actively discouraging that crucial verification step.
That's the argument, yeah. It inadvertently incentivizes research that might be quicker, maybe flashier, but potentially less robust, which feeds right back into the replication problem.
Okay, so we've got market pressures, replication issues. The paper also connects this commodification to a decline in ethical standards, right?
Yeah.
How does that connection work?
Well, when the pressure cooker environment gets intense enough pressure for funding, for publications, for profile, the paper suggests those ethical lines can start to get blurry for some.
And it gives examples.
It does. Some quite high-profile ones, unfortunately. It mentions Diederik Stapel in Social Psychology.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. He faked data in dozens of papers, didn't he?
He did. A huge scandal. Massive damage to trust in that field. Then there are the questions raised about data manipulation in some of Dan Ariely's behavioral economics work.
Right.
And even more recently, think about COVID-19 research. There were several high-profile retractions, papers making big claims that fell apart, sometimes with undeclared conflicts of interest involved.
Like that study claiming smoking reduced COVID risk. That was retracted, wasn't it?
That's the kind of example the paper points to, yeah. These aren't just abstract worries. They show real-world consequences when ethics erode under pressure.
Okay, so the paper paints a pretty concerning picture. Commercial interests threatening the core integrity of science. What's the proposed fix, this Symphonics Paradigm? What's that about?
Right, the Symphonics Paradigm. It's put forward as a kind of alternative framework, a way to counter these negative effects we've been talking about. It's built on three main ideas: resonance, transparency, and harmony.
Resonance, transparency, harmony. Okay, let's break those down. What's resonance?
Resonance, in this context, means making sure research is really aligned with two things: genuine societal needs,
Okay,
and what the paper calls epistemic rigor, which is basically just a fancy way of saying sound, reliable scientific methods, getting the science right, and making sure it addresses important problems.
Gotcha. So good science focused on what matters. What about transparency? That sounds straightforward.
It mostly is. It's about openness. Open access to the data, the methods used, even where the funding came from.
Why is that so important?
Because it allows other scientists and the public to really scrutinize the work, to check it. That openness builds trust. If everything's hidden, it's harder to trust the conclusions.
Makes sense. And the last one, harmony. What does that entail? Collaboration.
Exactly. Harmony is all about encouraging collaboration, especially across different disciplines, breaking down those silos that can form between fields,
Which can sometimes be driven by competition for funding within those fields.
Precisely. Market thinking can sometimes pit fields against each other. Harmony aims for the opposite, working together. Think about something like the Human Genome Project.
Okay.
That wasn't just one lab. It involved massive collaboration across disciplines, genetics, computing, ethics, sharing data openly. That's the kind of harmony the paper talks about.
So resonance, transparency, harmony. Sounds good in principle.
Yeah.
But how do you actually do that? How would you implement this Symphonics paradigm in the real world?
The paper suggests a few concrete things. One big one is regulatory changes. Getting universities, funding agencies to actually change their rules.
How?
To prioritize things like replicability. Is this research likely to be verifiable? And does it offer long-term benefits to society, not just short-term economic gains or easy-to-count publications, shifting the criteria for success?
Okay, changing the rules of the game. What about the researchers themselves? How do you change the culture?
That's where ethical training comes in. The paper talks about embedding symphonic ethics into education.
Sonic ethics, what does that involve?
Things like fostering genuine curiosity, intellectual humility, being willing to be wrong, and really emphasizing the value of collaboration over just individual achievement, building it into how scientists are trained.
I like that phrase, symphonic ethics. And it's not just about the scientists and institutions, is it? The paper mentioned the public, too.
Absolutely. Community engagement is key, bringing the public into the conversation about what research should be prioritized, helping people understand the process, the outcomes. It builds that broader trust and understanding.
And you mentioned the Human Genome Project earlier as an example of this symphonics in action.
Yes, exactly. The paper holds it up as a case study. Largely publicly funded, huge international collaboration, commitment to open data, clear long-term societal goal. It shows these principles can work and lead to amazing breakthroughs.
It's interesting to think how we got here. The paper briefly touches on the history, right? Linking commodification back to industrial changes and how universities started operating more like businesses.
Yeah, it connects it to broader historical trends like the rise of capitalist structures influencing academia, and specifically the big surge in large research grants mid-20th century, meant to boost science, which it did.
What?
But it also, maybe unintentionally, helped create a system where chasing grant money became a central part of the academic game, sometimes overshadowing other scientific values.
And this isn't the same everywhere in the world, is it? The paper notes differences based on funding models
Right. It contrasts places with more market-driven funding, like the US or China, where these commodification issues might be more pronounced.
versus places with stronger public funding traditions, like Scandinavia.
Exactly. And that difference can shape what kind of research gets done globally. Maybe neglecting areas important to low-income countries, for example, because they don't fit the dominant market priorities.
Another part of the system that gets critiqued is peer review, how work gets published. How does the paper see that fitting in?
Well, it points out known issues, like the bias towards publishing positive results. Studies that find something interesting get published more easily than the studies that find nothing happened, or studies that just replicate earlier work.
Which makes it harder to get a balanced picture.
Definitely. And the Symphonics idea could help here by, say, creating better incentives to publish those replication studies or the null results, making them valued parts of the scientific record, not just things that get filed away.
And of course, we have to talk about AI. How does artificial intelligence fit into this picture of commodification and science?
It's a double-edged sword, according to the paper. On one hand, AI tools could potentially make things worse, maybe amplifying biases towards trendy topics that get lots of clicks and citations. But on the other hand, AI could also be a powerful tool for Symphonics, helping researchers collaborate better, manage huge data sets, maybe even help automate parts of the verification process. It depends how we choose to develop and use it.
It really feels like changing the mindset, starting with education, is crucial.
The paper strongly emphasizes that, training researchers from the start not just in methods, but in these ethical principles, in interdisciplinary thinking, helping them navigate these complex pressures with integrity.
And thinking beyond just counting papers, the paper suggests different ways to measure success.
Yeah, metrics beyond publication. Like, how do we actually assess the real-world impact of research on society? How do we measure and reward good community engagement? Broadening the definition of scientific success.
So fundamentally, it sounds like it calls for some pretty big shifts in policy, from governments, funding bodies.
Definitely. The paper makes direct recommendations. Prioritize long-term societal good over short-term profit. Build transparency into funding decisions, ensure robust ethical oversight, real systemic changes.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive on the commodification of science, the core argument we've explored is that this growing focus on economic value in science is posing a serious risk.
Yeah, a risk to its credibility, leading to problems like the replication crisis, ethical lapses, undermining public trust.
And the proposed way forward is this Symphonics Paradigm built on resonance, transparency, and harmony.
Trying to re-anchor science in, rigorous inquiry that genuinely serves society, conducted openly and collaboratively.
It certainly leaves you with a lot to think about. Considering all those pressures we discussed, the incentives in different fields, how could we actually apply these Symphonics principles day to day? How do we make that shift happen? Really bring the focus back to reliable knowledge for everyone? It's a big question to ponder, especially in relation to your own work or areas you follow closely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.